Okay.
Thanks everyone, Luki. I know that today is an emotional day and many people prefer to be outside or with friends or rest after um, such long 12 days of this war. But we are happy to have Asif, and I'll just remind that it's the second webinar that we organized together as two projects, Точка встречи, that my colleague Zhenya and I lead, and TEDx Centers, which Sasha represents here. And we are trying to create a space where we together can think of what is happening and try to find some balanced perspectives. And with Asif, we're going to talk about how wars affect democracy and perception of democracy in Israeli society. Thank you so much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So a little bit about myself and the institute that I belong to. So I'm Asif Efrat. I'm a professor of government at Raichman University, and I'm also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Liberty and Responsibility, which is a research institute housed within Raichman University, dedicated to the study of Israeli politics. And one can study Israeli politics from various directions, from various perspectives. We focus on the perspective of public opinion. In a democracy, public opinion, what the public thinks, this is a very important issue that has or is supposed to have an impact on the government and what the government does. And so we conduct periodic public opinion polls at least once a month, sometimes more than once a month. And in these public opinion polls, we assess trends in Israeli public opinion. We get a sense of the policy preferences of Israelis, what Israelis think on a variety of issues, security issues, economic issues, issues relating to religion and state, what Israelis want, what Israelis think. And we also put an emphasis on the values of Israelis, and especially the commitment of Israelis to democratic and liberal values. To what extent do Israelis believe in democracy? Are they actually committed to the democratic system of government? To what extent they believe in equal rights to all citizens? Do they believe that everyone should receive the right of free speech regardless of their opinion? So we try to assess and measure Israelis' commitment to democratic values and ideals. And this will be the focus of my presentation today. Let's see. Can you all see it? The presentation was prepared in advance.
Yes.
It's in Hebrew, but I'll describe in English. So one of the things that we did during the war is try to capture public opinion, and especially how the war and the dramatic and traumatic experience of the war shapes public opinion. Because typically when people look at any war, and especially the war in Gaza, they tend to focus on the material price or material costs of the war. How many people, how many soldiers were killed, how many people were wounded, how many people fell captive and became hostages. Typically, when we think about the costs of war, we think in these terms: wounded people, casualties. But we tried to detect the cost of the war in Gaza in democratic terms. What has been the impact of the war's experience on Israeli democracy and on the Israeli public's commitment to democracy? Because we know, and this is, I think, quite intuitive, and this has been confirmed by many studies, security threats and wars are not good for democracy, right? And I think this is straightforward. War is a very painful experience. It's a very traumatic experience. We feel afraid. We feel deep uncertainty. And during war, it is very tempting to say, okay, we are willing to do away with various rights in the name of security. We are willing to sacrifice even democracy itself, because the most important thing is to defeat the enemy and regain security. So obviously, security threats and wars pose a significant threat to democracy and to democratic and liberal perceptions. And so it's always important to assess the impact of wars on democratic attitudes of the public. And what is unique here in the experience of the Gaza war is that Israelis entered the war in October of 2023 at a high point of democratic attitudes as a result of the experience that Israelis had immediately prior to the war. And that is the battle over the democracy, or the government's effort to subvert and undermine democracy by curtailing the powers and independence of the judiciary. I'm sure you're all familiar with the large-scale protests and battle for democracy that took place in Israel between January and September of 2023. And this was really a difficult moment for Israeli democracy. But again, through our public opinion polls, we see that actually this experience of fighting for democracy made Israelis more strongly committed to democracy, because Israelis realized during this period that democracy cannot and should not be taken for granted. They realized that democracy is actually under threat. And so we detect in various measures of democratic and liberal commitment that Israelis actually became stronger believers in democracy and democratic ideals as a result of this experience of fighting for democracy in early 2023. So Israelis enter the war in October 2023 at a high point of democratic commitment. And as I will show you in our findings, the war actually reversed the positive trend of growing commitment to democracy. And actually we see a decline in democratic attitudes in Israel as a result of the war, again, as one would expect. I mean, this is not something surprising. This is something that we would have expected to see, a reduction in democratic commitment and beliefs as a result of the war. But of course, again, for us as Israelis committed to democracy, this is still very unfortunate. So what do we see, and how do we measure commitment to democracy? So thus far, I talked about measuring or evaluating or assessing Israelis' commitment to democracy in kind of broad, vague terms. So how exactly do we measure and how do we capture Israelis' commitment to democracy? So one way to capture individuals' commitment to democracy is to ask them to what extent they are willing to replace the democratic system of elected government with kind of a strongman, an authoritarian leader that is released from democratic constraints. So, for example, one question that we ask periodically every 3 months or so is, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? In order to address Israel's unique problems, we need a strong leader who dismisses the Knesset and who dismisses elections. Okay? And so obviously, if you say yes, if you state your agreement with this statement, this means that you are not very strongly committed to democracy, and you are willing to replace the democratic government with strongmen who is not constrained by parliament or elections. And so typically we have about a quarter of Israelis who express their statement, who express their consent with this kind of statement. So for example, in July of 2023, 3 months prior to the war, 27% of respondents in our poll stated their agreement with this statement. They believe that Israel actually needs a strongman. Now, when we asked the same question in February of 24, that is 4 months into the war, the rate of agreement with the statement rose by 10 percentage points. from 27% to 37%. Okay, so this is a significant increase, 10 percentage point, a significant increase. So in February 24, we have more than a third of Israelis who believe that Israel actually requires a strongman rather than an elected and constrained government. So again, this is kind of an alarming indicator for reduction in Israelis' democratic commitment. Now, one of the hallmarks of democracy is freedom of speech, right? One would say that freedom of speech is the most important, the most cherished right that a democratic system offers. And so we have various questions in our poll that measure Israelis' support for free speech. And first, I will show you some of the so-called unique questions. That is questions that are not recurring in our surveys, but questions that are unique to the context of the war. And so the war, especially in the beginning, was marked by significant restrictions on free speech, the police prohibiting demonstrations in expression of sympathy with the people of Gaza, and also arrests and threat to prosecute people who talked in praise of Hamas, for example. So again, from a democratic point of view, these kinds of restrictions are problematic, right? Because you have to, especially in times of war, you have to allow dissent. You have to allow people to speak their mind and to say critical things, even if these statements, even if this speech is hurtful or offensive to many or most other citizens. But this is the idea of free speech, to allow the minority to express itself, to allow dissent, to allow criticism of government policy. And so we asked Israelis whether they support the limitations, the restrictions on free speech that were imposed at the time. So we asked, for example, do you support prosecuting individuals who praised Hamas in public? And here we see almost a universal support, 95% support for prosecuting individuals who praised Hamas. A large majority also supports a prohibition on demonstrations to express sympathy with the people of Gaza. Now, what about political criticism? Right. So in the questions that I just described, we talked about expressing sympathy or support for Palestinians, either the people of Gaza or Hamas. What about political criticism during war? Is it legitimate to actually criticize the government that is conducting the war? And again, from a democratic perspective, one would say yes, right? Especially during war, it is important, even necessary, to criticize the government. If you think that the government is not leading the country in the right way, that the military campaign might go awry, it is your duty to actually speak your mind and criticize the government. But when we look at what right-wing voters think about political criticism during war, we see that they have serious reservations or actually opposition to the idea of criticizing the government during war. So, for example, we asked people, do you support a prohibition on demonstrations, the call upon the prime minister to resign during the war? And 74% of right-wing voters, three quarters of right-wing voters said yes, they do not think that it is legitimate to call on the prime minister to resign during war. Now, you may remember the billboards that were seen at various spots in Israel, billboards with a picture of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and then the writing, Ata Harosh, Ata Hashem, you're the head of state, you are guilty. Basically, these are blunt messages that place the responsibility for the massacre of October 7th on the prime minister. And we asked our respondents in the polls, do you think that this is legitimate criticism of the prime minister, or do you think that this is illegitimate incitement against the prime minister? And a large majority, nearly 80% of right-wing voters said this is not legitimate political criticism. This is actually incitement. Okay, so again, we see that right-wing voters are quite intolerant to political speech, to political criticism during war. They think that war is basically not the right time to express criticism or dissent. Now, if we look at our recurring questions, our periodic questions, one question that we ask is, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? Free speech should be guaranteed even to people who talk against the state, even to people who criticize the state. And so we see here that in July of 2023, prior to the war, 2/3 of Israelis, 67%, said yes. Even people who talk against the state and criticize the state, they should enjoy freedom of speech. 4 months into the war, a significant decline in the rate of Israelis who express their support for political criticism. The rate of support declines to 54%. And then we looked at another issue that is important to Israeli democracy, and that is the rights of minority, and especially the rights of the Arab minority, Arabs residing in Israel, Arabs, citizens of Israel, and whether they are entitled to equal rights in Israeli democracy, which is defined as a Jewish country, right? What is the place of Arab citizens? Are they guaranteed equal rights? Now, our responses, the responses that we got to our questions show how basically Israelis conflate Arabs who are citizens of Israel and the Palestinians in the territories and in Gaza. And although during the war in Gaza, we fight against Palestinians, against Hamas, a terrorist organization whose members are not Israeli citizens, basically, for many Israelis, all Arabs are the same. And so if we are fighting Arabs in Gaza, this leads to a more negative attitude toward Israelis who of Arab descent, toward Arab Israelis. And so, for example, one of the questions that we ask periodically is, to what extent do you agree with the following? The Israeli government should make more effort to guarantee equal rights to Arab citizens. And so in July of 2023, prior to the war, we have a majority of 60% of Israelis who express consent with this statement, who believe that Arab citizens should be guaranteed equal rights. And this rate of support declines to 47%, less than majority, in February of 2024. Another question that we ask about the rights of Arabs has to do with the right to vote, perhaps the most basic, most fundamental right in a democracy. And so we ask the following. Do you agree with the following statement? We should take away the right to vote in elections from individuals who refuse to declare that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And of course, this is an actual proposal that was once floated. And although Arabs are not named here, this is clearly an anti-Arab measure, right? Because many, perhaps most Arab citizens of Israel will refuse to declare that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. And they might be threatened if this proposal is actually enacted. They are threatened with the depriving of their right to vote. And so in July 2023, prior to the war, we have roughly a third of Israelis who believe that this is actually a good idea to deprive Arab citizens of the right to vote. And this is obviously alarming enough, right? So a third of Israelis believe that Arabs should be deprived the right to vote. And the rate of support leaps to 52%, the majority of Israelis in February of 2024. Okay, so again, we see a significant erosion in the Jewish majority's attitude toward Israel's Arab citizens as a result of the war. Now, another interesting question that we have is about the attitude toward the Arab minority, but not in terms of guaranteeing fundamental rights or equality, but about personal interaction, right? Are Israelis, to what extent are we Israelis willing to have kind of a meaningful, personal, face-to-face interaction with Arab citizens? And so one of the questions that we ask is the following. Let's assume that you need some kind of renovation or repair in your home, right? What would you prefer? Would you prefer to turn to a Jewish handyman, an Arab handyman, or it doesn't matter to you? And so in July of 2023, prior to the war, about a quarter of Israelis said they would prefer a Jewish handyman to come to their home and do the repair work. And this again increased significantly to 41% in February of 2024. So again, the war made Israelis less supportive of rights and equality for Arab citizens, and also much less interested in personal interaction with Arab citizens in Israel. So in summary, we can say that war has the visible and tangible costs, again, casualties, hostages, destruction of homes and other infrastructure. So these are the visible costs of war, but wars also have a more hidden cost, which is the erosion and the undermining of democracy and democratic values. And this is hidden because this is something that one cannot really see, right? This erosion of liberal democratic values is something that we detect through periodic large public opinion polls. But to the average Israeli, this cost is hidden from view. But when we talk about the costs of wars in general and the cost specifically of our current war, we have to take into account this hidden yet important cost of the erosion of our democracy. And the tragedy is that this erosion follows a democratic moment. The battle over democracy in early 2023 actually led to a surge of democratic and liberal attitudes in Israel, and this was completely reversed, unfortunately, as a result of the war. Okay, so these are my findings, and now we can open up for questions and discussion.
Thank you. Oh, I have an echo. Wait. Okay, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you coming to us. And if anyone has questions, please raise your hands and ask, or you can write them in the group chat, and we can also read them for you. I had a question, if no one is eager to ask.
Sure.
I know that you're more of a researcher, I assume, than of an activist, but based on your experience and on the knowledge that we have, how to make people more drawn to democratic values? Through what?
How to make people more drawn to democratic values? Well, as you indeed indicated, I'm not an activist or an expert in democratic education. This is not my specialty. But I think the most important thing from our perspective is to inform people about their rights, to inform people about what people are thinking, especially if we want to support those who are fighting for democracy, then we can provide them with knowledge, with the understanding that actually many people are thinking like them, that there is this kind of shared democratic commitment or shared democratic attitudes, and I think this can boost individuals' willingness to come forward and engage in protest if they know that what they're doing, that the cause that they're advancing actually enjoys public support. And this is actually part of the mission of the institute that I belong to actually assess democratic support for various norms and to make people aware that there's actually public support that people sometimes do not realize. If I can give actually an example from another area unrelated to the war, and this is actually an article that I'm working on these days. And this has to do with the so-called separation of women in Israel, right? In recent years, over the past 12 or 10 or 15 years, there have been growing efforts to remove women from the public arena or from the public view, right? And this takes various forms. This can be buses for the Haredi population, where women are required to sit in the back of the bus. These can be public events, like events held by local authorities or national ceremonies that are held in separation. There is one section for men, and then there's a separate section for women. Or these can be so-called modesty signs, signs or ads in public places that call upon women to wear modest clothes. And now many people resent this kind of attempt to separate and remove and distance women from the public arena, but then there is the sense that maybe there's actually a majority or a significant group of Israelis who support these measures, right? And so we actually held a number of surveys trying to assess to what extent or what percentage of Israelis are actually supporting these anti-women measures. Now, do you want to guess? Let's see how well you know Israelis. Okay, so let's see. How many Israelis do you think support the idea of holding public events in separation? One section for men and a separate section for women. What is your guess?
30%.
Okay, 30.
20 something.
30, okay, in the 30s. Other guesses? Okay, so according to our polls, it's about 25%. So it's actually lower than you would expect. So obviously, Haredi people are, supportive of separating men and women in public gatherings, and some of the people who are religious but not ultra-Orthodox. But the majority of Israelis, 75% of Israelis, they're actually not supportive of this form of separating or removing women and other forms of anti-women measures. And so I think one way to encourage activism is to let people know that actually there's a majority that is often silent, but a majority who supports the democratic values, the democratic ideals. And I think this can give encouragement to activists. They may feel that their goals are more legitimate. This gives them more ammunition to use against those who support anti-women measures. So this is one thing, I think. The knowledge, getting a sense of actual support or opposition for different policies. And this, I think, gives support and gives an effective argument for those fighting for democracy.
Thank you. Nina, I can see your hand, but I'll read the question from the group chat first. Now, following the ceasefire, do you foresee a normalization of relations with the Arab minority in the future and a return to democratic values?
During the current ceasefire, a normalization with the Arab minority and a return to them.
There is a ceasefire right now. Do you think it will lead to normalization of relationships between Jews and Arabs and a return to democratic values?
So that's a good question. So what I showed you in the results from the polls is the short-term impact of the war. So there's this kind of shock, this unexpected, sudden, traumatic experience of the war breaking out. And we saw that 3-4 months into the war, Israelis respond by lowering their commitment to democratic values. Whether democratic commitment will be restored, this is an open question. And unfortunately, I'm not sure what the answer is. It will take a while, maybe a year or two after the war ends, and the war, despite the ceasefire, the war in Gaza, unfortunately, has not ended. As we heard today in the news, about 7 soldiers who were killed. So we're still in the midst of war. It's a very long and painful war. And I'm not sure whether the damage to democratic values in Israel is temporary, just a result of the shock of the war, and in the long term, democratic values will be restored, or whether we might be experiencing long-term or permanent damage to democratic values in Israel. The war, again, is still ongoing, so it's too early to tell.
Thank you. Nina, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your speech. The question is, do you have any data on the people who changed their opinion from July 23 to February 24 that you showed us? Like, who are them who changed their mind?
Data from between July. Well, that's a good question. Actually, I have to say that for scholars, it takes a long time to analyze the data and reach conclusions. And we're actually conducting several academic studies based on the data that I presented to you. And this is one of the things that we are going to actually assess: who changed their minds. In many cases, these were actually right-wing voters who expressed this kind of democratic moment in early 2023. In July 2023, they came to express more liberal views than those that they used to hold before. And then, following the breakout of the war, they reverted to their original views. But we actually see some shifts also in the opinions and views of left-wing voters. And this is true with respect to the values that we measure, and I presented to you, and also when we looked at support for substantive policies. For example, perhaps the most important question between Israelis and Palestinians, support for the two-state solution. As a result of the war, we see decreasing support for the two-state solution. And this comes also from the decreasing support is also the decreasing support of left-wing voters. So we see the change across the political spectrum.
Thank you. Arseny?
Yes. Do we see the difference in distributions on these main questions which we discussed in terms of geography? Like in Tel Aviv, it can be drastically different from the distribution in Jerusalem or in the mixed communities. And also the same question applies to the previous question about what rules which we have to in these situations. Does these differences, if there are differences in geography in terms of geographical distributions, can it be used as a tool? So, like, I don't know, the question on transportation on Shabbat, the attitude in Haifa and in Jerusalem are quite different, but the one city which is more like open-minded in this question can be a model for other cities if it proves that it works on its example.
So in our data, we don't do analysis by the place of residence of respondents. We do ask people where they live, but when we slice the data, we look at right-wing voters versus left and center voters. We look at the attitudes of Jews compared to the attitudes of Arabs. Sometimes we divide the data by age group, comparing young individuals in their 20s and 30s to older individuals, sometimes by level of education, but we do not look at the place of residence of individuals. But actually, if you mentioned the issue of public transportation on Shabbat, here I would like to note that on this specific issue, and also on the issue of gay rights, for example, here, surprisingly, we do not see the impact of the war. So as a result, I said that as a result of the battle over democracy in 2023, we see a surge in commitment to democracy and liberal rights, which was reversed as a result of the war. It was reversed concerning free speech. We see a reduction in support for the rights of the Arab minority in Israel. But for example, on issues of religious freedom, support for public transportation on Shabbat, or support for civil marriage in Israel, we see increasing support as a result of the protests and the fight for democracy in 2023. Support actually increased, and the war did not reverse this increase. And our guess is that people do not think that religious freedom has anything to do with the war, right? So during the war, people feel less committed to free speech because they don't like the idea of expressing public dissent or public criticism. They express less commitment to the rights of Arabs because Israel is fighting with Arabs. And so we see the decreasing support for free speech and for Arab equality as a result of the war, but the increased level of support for religious freedom remained intact. Also, the increased level of support for gay rights remained intact because these issues, gay rights, public transportation, civil marriage, these are unrelated to the war. So this is kind of a democratic gain from 2023 that the war luckily did not erase.
May I ask you to elaborate on the differences in terms of age groups, if you remember the results, because you've said that you do some slices like this.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we don't do that a lot. Typically, we look at Jews versus Arabs, right wing versus left wings. Sometimes we do look again at the differences between age groups. I can give you another example from the war. This is the issue of, well, actually, I can give you two examples for differences between the age groups. One is the issue of increasing religiosity. And this is also something that we detected during the war. We know from research in other countries that sometimes people become more religious, they become more connected to religious, they become closer to God as a result of the traumatic experience of war, right? Because war is a time of anxiety, of uncertainty, of hardship. And so during the war, people typically look for something that will provide them with comfort or with certainty when the world around them is collapsing. And so people are becoming closer to religion and to God. And so we asked in our surveys, to what extent do you think that the war made you closer to religious tradition or closer to God? And about a third of Israelis, 31% of Israelis said that they feel that the war brought them closer to God and to religious tradition. But when we slice this by age, we saw that this closeness to God was more prominent among young Israelis. Okay, so young Israelis reported in higher rates that the war brought them closer to war and religion. And we think that this is part of a general trend that we see among young individuals in Israel. They tend to become closer to religion, perhaps because they're looking for meaning in their lives or because they feel lost. And so they sometimes turn to religion. And so when we look at the impact of the war on religiosity, we see we see the effect especially pronounced on young individuals in their 20s or early 30s.
May I ask a short question? Or,
Sure.
Have you done any follow-up since February 24? Because it was a quite shocking first 4 months of the war, and of course
Right.
it's a lot. But now we are in an endless war of a year and a half. And do we see any changes in this polls?
Right. So the picture is mixed, and we see different kinds of changes along different dimensions. As I said, in some cases we see Israelis going back not entirely to the original attitudes that they expressed prior to the war, but becoming closer, perhaps. So, for example, we see a lower rate of support for the strong leader, right? If in February of 24 we see 36%, then the rate of support for a strong leader has come down somewhat since. But on other measures of attitudes toward Arabs, for example, the support for rights is not fully recovered. So it's kind of a mixed picture.
Thank you.
If you have time, I have one more question. Do you have?
Sure.
Go for it, but can you speak a bit louder?
Right. I wanted to ask, which impact do we expect after this war with Iran? If
right. So the war in Iran is kind of a short war, and it's a war within a war, right? These are not completely separate wars. So it's difficult to detect the impact of the war on support for democracy. The most important impact of this episode, of this violent episode against Iran, is not really in the impact on democracy, but the impact on attitudes toward the government and the prime minister. We see stronger support, stronger trust for the government and for the prime minister, as one would expect, right? This is actually a phenomenon that political scientists are very familiar with. It's called the rally around the flag effect. And this means that in times of a national security emergency, in times of security crisis, typically the leader, say the prime minister or the president, they experience a support, a boost in their public support, right? Because during emergency, we all tend to rally around the leader because the leader is leading us, he's protecting us, he's leading the fight against the enemy. And so we typically tend to forget all of our criticism, normal criticism of the leader, and we tend to express greater support. And indeed, we find a significant increase in public support for Netanyahu and for the current government as a result of the war with Iran. Of course, it's an open question of if Netanyahu has actually initiated the war to gain this increased public support. And again, this is a theory in the field of political science saying, well, those leaders who experience a domestic political struggle, who find it difficult to maintain their rule, to maintain their government, they may actually initiate an international conflict. They may actually start a war because they expect this kind of rally, this kind of increased public support as a result for the war. So they start the war in order to stabilize their government. And Netanyahu's critics obviously believe that at least part of the motivation for the current war with Iran was Netanyahu's desire to regain public support. But of course, we cannot tell whether or not this was part of his consideration.
Thank you. If you don't have any question, probably Masha, what do you think? Probably we can finish the meeting.
We can have the last question if there is any, or we can wrap it up here.
Pardon?
We have time for one more question if there is anything else unanswered, or we can wrap it up here. Seems like we're good. Everything is clear. Thank you so much for being here with us, and thanks everyone for coming and for your interest.
Okay, it was a pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you, Asif.
Take care and have a good evening.
Bye.